Welcome to a new series called How To, at which I will explain certain topics about creating a Duel Commander deck. Since I've received a lot of feedback from new players about their struggle on how to build a successful deck, I'm going to start the series with the first episode about building your Manabase. The two questions that generally raise are how many lands should I play and which lands should I actually play. So to answer your question, let's jump right into it. According to MTG Top 8, I took some numbers from the statistics. Keep in mind that they mainly serve to orient yourself, so those are no fixed numbers because the amount of lands you play is always dependent on the average converted mana cost in your deck, as well as your commander synergies in some cases. For example, if you ever experience to play a lands deck featuring Titania or Azusa, you will notice quite fast that those types of decks demand more lands than an average type of deck. So with that being said, let's look at the numbers. Aggressive decks play an average of 35 to 38 lands regarding decks like Saskia, White Weenie or Karizev. Control decks obviously always run a bit more lands. We have an average of 39 to 41 lands, and I've taken data into account from Aminatu, Partner Control, and Kess. And combo decks are very specific about their land counts. Tymna Thrasios Allurant, for example, runs around 38 lands because it's a creature-based combo deck with a low average converted mana cost, while Gitrock, which is also a lands deck, can be played with combo or without, runs up to 48 lands. So generally, it is pretty hard to set a certain range of lands for combo decks. Now that we had a short look on the average numbers, let's head over to the important types of lands you should play. We will at first skip the choices for monocolored decks since it is most often very simple and sometimes a bit more complex. Therefore, I will show you two examples of such mana bases later on. The following lands you will see can be chosen for 2, 3, 4 color and sometimes 5 color decks. 5 color decks can be more complex. For example, if you're trying to build God of Storm, then you might not always include all the shock lands, or sometimes you don't need a wasteland. However, for most cases, you can feel pretty safe to include those cards in your deck. So what cards are we talking about? The first card that comes into your mind might often be Command Tower, probably one of the best lands for Duel Commander, of course for multiplayer Commander as well. Path of Ancestry, that's basically the same. It enters tapped and grants you a scry, which is pretty good, and the downside of having a land enter tapped is worth the upside of that land. Make sure to run all the fetch lands you can in your colors. For 2 color decks, for example, there are 7 available fetch lands that search for 2 types. If you have a lot of basic lands, or at least some basic lands, you can also include Prismatic Vista. In very rare cases, you can also play Fabled Passage. Most of the time, that decision belongs to the lands deck. The more colors you play, the more important it is to include original dual lands. 2 colored decks can be played without. For anything above, I would recommend it. However, if you're running a budget deck and you do not want to include the dual lands, you can play shock lands, of course, which should be included anyways in any other deck as well, because those are the second best lands to fetch. You can play the battle lands from Zendikar block, as well as the cycle lands from Amonkhet block. Last but not least, of all the lands you should definitely take into consideration when building a new deck, we do not forget about the one and only utility land, Wasteland. Especially if you are facing a very colorful meta with a lot of 3 and 4 color decks, which is currently quite popular. Wasteland is a good thing. Sometimes you can cut your opponent from the necessary color they need to cast their spells. Otherwise, it's just a very good ability to deal with any kind of utility lands. Let's look onto the optional land includes, which are still very good choices, but in case of fine-tuning, you might not always automatically include all of them. So most decks will always include fast lands and check lands. For the check lands, it's important to run maybe a few basic lands, or the original dual lands, shock lands, anything that gives the land a type to not enter tapped. That's very important. In 2 and 3 color decks you can almost always run filter lands. Those are very good lands, as well as pain lands in some cases. Filter and pain lands are most often not worth an include if we're talking about 4 and 5 color decks. Due to the high amount of good lands, their mana base is often already set before even brewing the deck. So let's go on and look onto some situational decisions you could take on brewing your mana base. I often see players including City of Brass and Mana Confluence in 2 or 3 or 4 color decks. That is not necessary in most cases, unless you are running a deck like Karlov, which is gaining so much life that the downside of losing a life doesn't matter, or decks that finish so fast that you can actually use life as a resource, for example Hogak or maybe Tymna Thrasios combo decks, especially if you're running mid-rangey or control decks that try to stretch the game towards mid or late game. Every point of life is crucial. You should always keep that in mind. Another set that's quite interesting is the recently added Drawland set from Modern Horizons. Those cards can especially be quite helpful for the aggressive decks because you have a draw ability on land, and although Duel Commander is more about mana advantage instead of card advantage, with those kind of decks you want to make sure to close the game as fast as possible, and if you can draw the needed spell in that situation because you play that land, that's very beneficial. And of course there are many utility lands to choose from. Which lands you can include in your deck most likely depends on your game plan and on the type of deck you're playing, but you have numerous choices here. Now that we have talked about different types of lands, where and when to include them, let's see a few examples of how a mana base could look like. As I said in the beginning, we skipped monocolored decks as their mana base is either very simple or more complex, but I will show you both cases right now. So here you can see a pretty simple version of a Red Deck Wins mana base. We're running 24 mountains, a couple of manlands, so Mishra's Factory and Mutavolt, as they can serve as buddies to deal damage to your opponent. We have Barbarian Ring and Ramunap Runes, which are both dealing damage under certain circumstances. We have Rishadan Port to lock our opponent, for example from casting counter spells or something like that. Sun-Scorched Desert is definitely a slot that you can consider. It's not a must include. And of course we're running Wasteland. Apart from that, 5 fetch lands to minimize the amount of lands in our library and thereby hiring the chance to draw a non-land card. The White Weenie mana base looks a bit different. We have a couple of more non-basic lands. First of all, we're playing 21 snow-covered plains because this deck is running on thin ice, so you need snow-covered lands, as well as the Frostwalk Bastion, which is only activated with mana from a snow-covered permanent. Aside from that, again, we have some manlands. Additionally to Wasteland, this deck is playing Tectonic Edge, Shepherd Dunes, which synergizes with a couple of creatures on board, Mouth of Ronan to deal with blockers, and things like Eldrazi Temple, since this deck is running a few Eldrazi's, or Cavern of Souls to make sure you can get your humans through counter spells safely. So last but not least, I would like to show you a very basic land base of Brush. You see all dual lands, fast lands, shock lands, command tower, the filter lands as well. Some players might wonder why this deck is running so many basic lands. It's simply because you're running Earthcraft as well as Wildgrowth and Utopia Sprawl, which are happy to be attached to a basic land instead of a non-basic land, in case your opponent has a wasteland to destroy 2 resources at one time. Apart from that, you have utility lands like Phyrexian Tower or Keswick Wolf Run, but overall it's a very basic 3-color mana base. With that being said, I hope that this video could help you to take easier decisions on building your mana base. Surely I have not covered all possible options. If I have missed important cards that are worth an include, let me know in the comments. If you want to see more of this series, leave me a feedback via the like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching and have a great day!